Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, my friends. It's Sunday night, and you know what that means. It's time to dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for another night of eerie encounters, twisted tales, and stories designed to keep you looking over your shoulder long after the final words are spoken. I'm your host, Otis Jiry. Now, my friends, there's something about shadows that we can never quite escape, isn't there? They follow us, linger at the edges of our vision, and sometimes, just sometimes, they become more than we ever thought possible. Tonight's stories aren't just about what lurks in the dark. No, my friends, these tales are about the shadows that come to life, ones that demand something in return. And joining me tonight, as always, is a man who knows all too well the cost of facing the darkness, Malcolm Blackwood. Malcolm, if you had to choose, would you rather face something that only exists in the dark, or something that has followed you from the very moment you stepped into the light?
That's a tough one, Otis, but I'll go with the first. At least I'd know where it was. If it's something that's followed me, that sounds like the kind of nightmare that doesn't let you wake up.
Ah, you and I think alike, Malcolm. But as tonight's stories will show, some things aren't bound by the night, and not all shadows stay where they belong.
And some bargains, once made, they're paid for in ways we can't even imagine.
Exactly. Our first tale tonight is a brand new story, one that'll make you think twice about what you might lose in exchange for survival. So sit back, but not too comfortably. You never know which shadow might reach out to claim its price. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, but want even more, we got you covered.
By joining our patrons area, you'll unlock the full extended episode, featuring all stories without interruptions, plus access to our entire Simply Scary Podcast Network archive. All this for just $7.99 per month, or save even more with an annual plan.
Head over to simplyscarypodcast.com and select Patrons in the top menu. You'll be directed to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can start your membership and dive into a world of exclusive horror.
Support indie creators, enjoy ad-free episodes, and double the terror. What could be better? Join us today. Thanks so much for your support. It means the world to us. Now, back to the show.
Our first story tonight takes us to a place where time itself doesn't quite behave the way it should, where the smallest slip in reality can leave you questioning everything. This tale of mystery and dread is titled The Disappearance of Daniel Caldwell by A.G. Greene. Performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. Detective Simon Harding had been on the force for over 2 decades, long enough to know when someone was lying and when they were just scared out of their mind. James O'Connor, the cabbie sitting across from him in the station's interrogation room, looked like a man who had seen something he wasn't ready to believe. His hands were clasped so tightly on the table that his knuckles had gone white. A styrofoam cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. "I already told the uniforms," O'Connor said, his voice low and raw. "Told them 3 times. I don't know what else you want me to say." "I want the truth," Harding said, folding his arms and leaning back in his chair. The room smelled like old coffee and sweat, the same scent every interrogation room in the city seemed to have. "From the beginning, one more time." O'Connor shook his head. "Fine, but you won't believe me." Harding didn't answer, he just waited, giving the man a moment to collect himself. O'Connor licked his lips and started again. "Picked the guy up on the corner of 8th and 44th, a little after 11. He was standing right by the curb, waving me down like he'd never seen a taxi before. I pulled up, and the guy, he looks off, you know. Clothes were old-fashioned, but not in a hipster way. Real old. Black wool suit, pocket watch, chain, one of those hats guys used to wear back when my grandfather was young. I thought maybe he was one of those reenactment types, tourist, I don't know." Harding made a note. "And he got in the cab?" "Yeah." O'Connor nodded. "Slid into the back seat, real stiff-like. Told me he needed to get to Pier 54. Gave me the street name and everything, like he wasn't sure I'd know what he meant. And his accent, man, like some old-timey movie, real proper, kind of British, but not exactly." Harding frowned. Pier 54 hadn't been an active passenger terminal in decades. What happened next? O'Connor's hands gripped the table again, his nails scraping against the wood. "I started driving, that's what. Guy didn't talk much. Kept looking out the window like he didn't recognize everything. Then about halfway there, he takes out this pocket watch, stares at it, flips it shut real fast, like he saw something he didn't like." Harding watched him carefully. "And then?" O'Connor swallowed hard. "And then he was gone." Silence settled between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Harding studied the man's face, waiting for him to crack, to admit to some embellishment or misunderstanding. But O'Connor just sat there, staring down at his hands like he wished they'd belonged to someone else. "Gone," Harding repeated. "Yeah." O'Connor laughed, but there was no humor in it. Like he was never there. "I looked in the mirror and the back seat was empty. No door opening, no sound, nothing. I slammed the brakes, jumped out, and checked around the cab, but he was just gone." Harding tapped his fingers against the table. "And that's when you called it in?" "Well, I wasn't gonna at first," O'Connor admitted. "Figured I was overtired, losing my mind. But then, not even 10 minutes later, I hear about the guy getting hit." He finally looked up, and the expression in his eyes made Harding uneasy. "You got no reason to believe me," O'Connor said. "I wouldn't believe me. But that guy in the street, the one they scraped off the pavement, it was him. Same suit, same pocket watch, same damn face. But you know what the freakiest part is?" Harding didn't answer. He didn't need to. O'Connor leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he feared someone else might hear. "Then you said he got hit before I even picked him up." By the time Harding arrived at the scene, the body had already been bag-tagged and sent off to the morgue. The intersection was mostly clear, save for a dark stain on the asphalt where the victim had landed. The crime scene techs were packing up, their work done. Harding waved down the uniform officer on duty. What do we have? Officer Ramirez flipped open her notepad. Male, late 20s to early 30s, no ID, no wallet, no phone. Witnesses say he just appeared in the middle of the street. Driver didn't have time to stop. Harding glanced up at the surrounding buildings. It was Times Square, cameras everywhere. We get any footage? Ramirez hesitated. Yeah, but it's weird. Harding raised an eyebrow. She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and handed it over. This is from one of the traffic cams. Harding hit play. The footage showed the crosswalk, the traffic, and the blur of city life. And then, just like that, there he was. There was no build-up, no approach from the sidewalk. One frame, the street was empty. The next, a man stood in the middle of the road, staring around in confusion. His mouth moved, but no sound came through the video. The next second, the taxi hit him. Harding let out a slow breath and handed the phone back. Jesus. Ramirez nodded. Yeah. Harding ran a hand over his jaw, then turned back toward his car. He needed to see the body. The morgue was quiet when Harding arrived, the kind of sterile quiet that made his skin crawl. Even Evelyn Marchand was already waiting for him, standing beside the sheet-covered corpse on the exam table. Oh, you're going to love this one, she said dryly, pulling back the sheet. The dead man was young, no older than 30. His features were sharp, his hair neatly combed, and his clothing immaculate, except for the places where the blood had soaked through. His suit was too pristine, the fabric rich and expensive, but old-fashioned in a way that was neither ironic nor deliberate. A gold chain stretched from his waistcoat pocket, leading to a watch clutched in his rigid fingers. Marchand tapped the watch. You're going to want to see this. Harding leaned in as she pried it from the corpse's grip. The hands had stopped moving. The glass face was cracked. The time read 2:20 a.m. Marchand crossed her arms. Recognize it? Harding frowned. Should I? She nodded. 2:20 a.m., April 15th, 1912. Cold chill crept over him. He didn't need her to spell it out. That was the moment the Titanic slipped beneath the Atlantic. Harding looked at the body again, at the flawless fabric of the suit that should have been a century out of fashion, at the untouched gold of a watch that should have been rusted over with time, and for the first time in a long while, he had no idea what to make of what he was seeing. Part 2. Detective Simon Harding sat in his car staring at the grainy black and white photo in his hands. The photo had been buried deep in the city archives, tucked away in a file that hadn't been touched in decades. It showed a group of men standing on the dock, posing in front of a massive ship. Their faces were sharp, their clothing crisp and formal. Collars stiff, shoes polished to a mirror shine. RMS Titanic, April 1912. And there, on the far right, half turned as if he had been distracted by something just off camera, was the man Harding had seen in the morgue, Daniel Caldwell. The same face, the same neatly combed hair, the same suit, no wrinkles, no sign of wear or aging, as though he had stepped straight out of 1912 and into the middle of Times Square without losing so much as a stitch. Harding tossed the photo onto the passenger seat. It didn't make sense. None of it did. He picked up his phone and dialed. After 3 rings, Aaron Finch answered. Tell me you got something good. Nah, it depends, Harding said. You ever hear of a guy named Daniel Caldwell? There was a brief pause on the other end. Caldwell, Finch repeated. Hang on. The sound of typing filled the line. It doesn't ring a bell off the top of my head, but let's see. Huh? What? Well, I found a Daniel Caldwell. Born 1884, died 1912. Third-class passenger on the Titanic. Finch let out a low whistle. Yeah, he went down with the ship. No body recovered. Harding tightened his grip on his steering wheel. Run it again. Find me a Daniel Caldwell after 1912. More typing. Nope, Finch said. Nothing. No records, no marriage certificates, no employment history. Like he never existed past the sinking. Harding reached for the photo again, rubbing his thumb over the glassy surface. Then how the hell did I just see him in a morgue? An hour later, Harding and Finch met in front of an old brick building on West 57th. The place had been a tenement back in Caldwell's time, but these days it was a bookstore, one of those independent shops that smelt like dust and candle wax, where the floorboards creaked underfoot and the walls were lined with shelves so tall they practically touched the ceiling. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped in. A woman at the counter looked up from a book. Her gray hair was pulled into a bun, and her round glasses made her eyes seem larger than they were. Detective Harding, I presume, she said. Harding exchanged a glance with Finch. That's me. You must be Margaret Elridge? Call me Maggie, she said, closing her book. Now, you said you were looking into a man who used to live here? Daniel Caldwell, Finch supplied. Maggie frowned, tapping her fingers against the calendar. Caldwell. Oh, yes, I do remember that name. Not personally, of course, I'm not that old. But I've seen it in the old property records. He rented a room here before he sailed on that dreadful ship. I remember because his rent was paid in full after he was supposed to have died. Harding stiffened. What? Maggie nodded. The records show payments made under his name well into 1913. After that, nothing. Who was making the payments? Finch asked. No idea. No forwarding address, no contact information, just a name and a ledger. Harding turned, looking around the shop. You ever hear anything strange about this place? Maggie hesitated. Strange how? You ever see anyone up there? Harding tilted his head toward the narrow staircase leading to the second floor. Anyone who shouldn't have been there. Her fingers twitched on the counter. People have said things, she admitted. Footsteps upstairs when no one's renting the place. A shadow in the window after closing time. Nothing concrete, but enough that I've had more than a few employees refuse to close alone. Harding glanced at Finch. We need to see that ledger. Maggie led him to the back of the shop, where an old wooden desk sat covered in stacks of yellowed paper and ledgers, so thick they looked like they belonged in a museum. She pulled one out from the bottom of a precarious pile and flipped it open. There, she said, tapping a faded name scrawled in elegant script. Daniel Caldwell. The payments, the records, were neat and consistent. Monthly installments listed under Caldwell's name, paid in cash. Then, abruptly, the entries stopped. March 1913, Finch murmured. That's the last one. Why would someone pay his rent if he was dead? Harding muttered. No one had an answer. The lights above them flickered. Maggie stiffened. It does that sometimes, she said, though there was an edge to her voice. Harding flipped to the back of the ledger, running his fingers along the frayed edges of the pages. The final few were blank, just empty space, until at the very bottom of the last page, a faint imprint of something that had been written, then erased. A name. Not Caldwell's. Something else. Finch leaned in, squinting. What the hell's that say? Harding traced the letters with his thumb. The ink had faded, but he could still make it out. Pier 54. A cold knot formed in Harding's stomach. You ever hear of anything weird about Pier 54, he asked. Maggie frowned. Nothing weird. It used to be a major terminal for transatlantic ships. The Titanic survivors were brought there after they were rescued. But it's not used for that anymore. It just ruins now. Harding replied. Caldwell told the cabbie that's where he was trying to go. Maggie's expression darkened. Detective, I don't know what you've got yourself into, but I'd be careful. There are stories about places like that. Some doors close forever, others just... She hesitated. Just stay open, waiting for something to come through. Harding didn't reply. Back in the car, Finch tapped his phone, pulling up an old newspaper article. "Here we go," he said. "Pier 54, March 1913. A dock worker named Henry Vaughn went missing. Last seen walking toward the end of the pier late at night. Witnesses said he looked dazed, like he was in a trance." Harding clenched his jaw. "Did they ever find him?" Finch scrolled further, then stopped. "No." Harding didn't like where this was going. He started the car. "We're going to the pier." Part 3. The dream came in pieces. Harding stood knee-deep in black water, the cold sinking into his bones. All around him, voices whispered and cried out, muffled as if trapped beneath the surface. A dull, rhythmic creaking filled the air, the strained sound of metal groaning under pressure. The water rose to his waist, then to his chest. The voices grew louder, a chorus of the lost, as something brushed against his leg. Harding woke with a start, his fingers curling around the edge of the motel nightstand, grounding himself in reality. The room was dark except for the neon glow from the sign outside, pulsing red against the walls. It was just a dream. That's all it was. But when he sat up, his palm brushed against something cold. He looked down to find his bed sheets damp. The night shift was in full swing when Harding arrived at the morgue. Dr. Elvin Marchand stood beside the exam table, her expression unreadable. The body of Daniel Caldwell lay precisely where they had left it, untouched since Harding's last visit. But something was wrong. "The hell happened to his hands?" Harding asked. The corpse's fingers were stiff, curled as if they had been gripping something tightly before death. Harding swore they had been relaxed earlier. Marchand shook her head. "I don't know. I noticed it when I came in for a final review before my paperwork went through." Harding reached for his notepad, flipping through his scribbled notes. "And you need to check something for me." "Already ahead of you," Marchand replied. She pulled the pocket watch from its evidence bag and laid it on the metal table between them. Glass was cracked, the hands had stopped, but the time had changed. "It's not what it said before," Harding murmured. "It wasn't," Marchand confirmed. "The last time we checked, the frozen watch was at 2:20 a.m. Now it's 2:17, Harding finished. 3 minutes earlier, a shift, a reversal. For a tense moment, neither of them spoke. Harding exhaled sharply and rubbed his face. "Okay, maybe somebody tampered with it." Marchand scoffed. "Detective, do you really believe that?" "No, he didn't." Harding straightened. "Check the security footage." Marchand frowned but walked over to the computer, pulling up the feed. The screen flickered to life. They watched in silence as the hours rolled past. Nothing moving, no one entering the room. Then at 3:14 a.m., the screen glitched. A full second of pure static. When the feed resumed, the corpse's left hand had moved. Marchand hit pause. Harding stared, his stomach sinking. Daniel Caldwell's fingers had curled inward, as if tightening around something unseen. Harding clenched his jaw. "That's not possible." Marchand didn't argue. They'd just watched it happen. Harding stepped outside to clear his head. The night was damp, a light drizzle coating the pavement. The city was never truly quiet, but at this hour it was as close as it ever got. His phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. "Detective Harding?" The voice was rough, worn at the edges. "Who's this?" "James O'Connor," the cabbie said. "We talked the other night. About that guy I picked up." Harding felt a chill creep down his spine. Yeah, I remember." There was a pause, then O'Connor exhaled shakily. "I saw him again." Harding's grip on the phone tightened. "Where?" "In my back seat," O'Connor said. "Again. Just now. He wasn't there when I got in, but the second I looked in the mirror..." He stopped to take a breath. He was sitting right there, staring at me. Same suit, same pocket watch, like nothing had happened. Harding's mouth went dry. "What'd you do?" "I didn't even get a chance to do anything," O'Connor said. "He was there for maybe 2 seconds, and then..." Static crackled through the line. "O'Connor?" The call cut out. Harding cursed under his breath, dialing back immediately. No answer. He pocketed his phone, jaw clenched. First, the hands had moved, then the time of the watch, and now a dead man was appearing in the back seat of a cab. Something wasn't just wrong, it was escalating. Finch was waiting for him when he got back to the car. The journalist's expression was bleak, his phone still clutched in his hand. "You're not going to like this," Finch said. "Try me." Finch turned his phone toward Harding. It was another old photo. This one wasn't of the Titanic. It was a grainy shot of Pier 54, taken from a newspaper article dated March 1913. The dark was wet, the woods slick with rain. A single man stood at the edge facing away from the camera. Harding felt his stomach drop. "Tell me that's not him," he said. Finch didn't answer. He didn't have to. Harding already knew the truth. Part 4. James O'Connor wasn't answering his phone. Harding tried 3 more times, pacing beside his car, the cold night air making his skin prickle. Each call went straight to voicemail. No ringing, no delay, just dead air and a mechanical voice telling him the number was unavailable. He turned to Finch. "You still have his address?" Finch nodded. "Yeah, it's in Queens. You thinking what I'm thinking?" "That we need to check on him?" Harding muttered. "Yeah." Finch climbed into the passenger seat. Neither of them spoke as Harding pulled onto the nearly empty road, heading toward O'Connor's place. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken possibilities. Harding didn't want to say it out loud, but if Caldwell was seen again, then who or what was in the morgue? O'Connor's apartment was on the 2nd floor of a narrow brownstone. The lights were on inside, casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk, giving Harding a flicker of hope. He knocked. No reply. He knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. Finch stepped back, eyeing the window. "He's home," he said, or at least he was. Harding tried the doorknob. It turned easily. Finch shifted uncomfortably. That's not a good sign. Harding stepped inside. The apartment was small and cluttered, but lived in. A couch with a blanket draped over it, half a pizza sitting in an open box on a coffee table. The air smelled faintly of cigarettes and cheap cologne. "O'Connor?" Harding called out. No answer. Finch pointed to the hallway where the bedroom door was ajar, the light flickering. Harding moved cautiously, his hand hovering near his holster. The bed was unmade, the nightstand drawer hung open, its contents spilled onto the floor, and the window was open. A cold gust pushed through the curtains, rattling the half-empty glass of water beside the bed. Finch swallowed. "You think he ran?" Harding didn't answer right away. He stepped toward the window and looked out onto the fire escape. Then he saw it, a pocket watch faintly glinting under the streetlights. It lay just outside the window, resting on the metal grate of the fire escape. Harding crouched, picked it up carefully. The moment his fingers touched the metal, something twisted in his gut. It was still warm. Finch took a step back. "That's not the same one from the morgue, is it?" Harding didn't answer because he already knew. The time on the watch had changed again. 2:14 a.m. Another 3-minute shift. They drove in silence. Finch kept glancing at the watch in Harding's hand, as if he were waiting for it to do something. Harding kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing. The pattern was clear now. The watch was counting backward. Every shift, 3 minutes closer to something. O'Connor had seen Caldwell again, and then he'd vanished. Was he taken back, or had he simply ceased to exist? Harding didn't know which answer was worse. And then as they neared the waterfront, something happened that made every hair on the back of his neck stand up. The watch in his hand ticked. Not a broken tick, not a glitch, but a single, crisp movement. 2:13 a.m. Pier 54 was nothing more than a ruin now. The old archway still stood, rusted and skeletal, but the dock itself had long since fallen into decay. Wooden planks jutted over the black water, some half-rotted, others missing entirely. Harding killed the engine. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Finch let out a shaky breath. Tell me we're not actually walking out onto that thing. Harding opened the door. Stay here if you want. Finch muttered a curse under his breath, but followed. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of salt and old wood. Waves lapped gently against the pilings below. A fog rolled in from the river, thick and low, swallowing the distant city lights. Harding stepped carefully, boots pressing into the worn boards. Something beneath them, the remains of a century-old terminal, rested at the bottom of the Hudson, buried in silt and time. The watch ticked again. 2:12 a.m. A shiver ran down Harding's spine. They reached the end of the pier, and then they heard it. A deep, echoing horn, low and mournful, drifting across the water. Finch tensed. That sounded like a ship, Harding finished. They both turned, staring out into the fog. There was nothing there, just the empty black water. But then a faint light appeared, distant, flickering, moving. A reflection shimmered across the surface, distorted by the rippling waves. The shape was massive, stretching out of the darkness, growing sharper by the second. It was impossible. A ship, emerging from the fog. Not just any ship. A transatlantic liner. The air around them went still. The sounds of the city faded into nothing. And then from behind them, footsteps. Finch grabbed Harding's arm. We're not alone. Harding turned slowly. The figure stood at the edge of the pier, tall, silent, and watching. Pocket watch ticked once more. 2:11 a.m. Part 4. Harding's hand twitched toward his gun, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. The figure at the edge of the pier was barely visible through the mist, but Harding could make out the details. Tall, dressed in a dark wool suit, posture stiff as if he were waiting for something, or someone. The pocket watch in Harding's hand ticked again. 2:10 a.m. The figure took a step forward, the old wood groaning underfoot. Finch let out a low breath beside him. Tell me that's not. Harding didn't answer. He already knew. Daniel Caldwell stood before them, his face pale, his suit still immaculate, untouched by time or decay. His eyes, however, were different, dark and hollow, as though he had already seen what he was waiting for. Harding swallowed. Caldwell. The man's lips parted slightly as if hearing his name stirred something in him, but he didn't respond. Another sound broke the silence, a distant splash. Something moved beneath the water. Harding ignored it, keeping his eyes locked on Caldwell. You were in the morgue, Harding said. You died. Caldwell blinked slowly, as though processing the words. Then finally he spoke, his voice calm but distant, as if being pulled from somewhere far away. No, he said. Not yet. Finch shifted uncomfortably. What do you mean, not yet? Caldwell didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his hand and pointed to the water. Harding followed his gaze. The fog had thickened, swirling over the river's surface. The ship was clearer now, a massive shape emerging from the mist, its lights flickering like dying lanterns. But there was something else. Dark figures, barely visible, stood along the railing, watching and waiting. A deep, echoing horn rumbled through the night, vibrating through Harding's chest. The ship was coming in. Caldwell turned back to Harding, his face eerily calm. It's almost time. The pocket watch ticked again. 2:09 a.m. Harding tightened his grip on the watch. What happens at 2:07, he asked. Caldwell didn't blink. I go home. Harding's jaw clenched. Home. Back to 1912. Back to a sinking ship. Finch took a shaky step backward. This is insane. Caldwell's gaze flickered toward him. I don't belong here. Harding's mind raced. None of this should be possible. A man peering out of nowhere, his body found in a place he shouldn't have been, a pocket watch counting down instead of forward, and now a ship that had sunk over a century ago, waiting at the edge of the fog. But the worst part was that some part of him believed it. Caldwell exhaled slowly. It's already begun. Harding barely had time to react before the sound of rushing water and splintering wood filled the air. Beneath them, the pier shuddered and groaned. Something massive was rising from the water. Finch staggered backward as the dock trembled. What the hell is... The water near the pier boiled, waves crashing against the pilings. A shape broke the surface, long, black, like the twisted remains of something ancient being pulled from the depths. For a split second, Harding thought it was wreckage, a sunken piece of the Titanic, finally surfacing after all these years. And then it moved. A long skeletal hand, slick with water, reached onto the pier, and the wood buckled under the weight. Another hand followed. Finch swore. That's not human. Harding didn't respond because he knew. This wasn't just about Daniel Caldwell. Something else had come back with him. The thing hauled itself upward, a dark, twisted form, dragging itself onto the pier. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even close. Its body was long and gaunt, its skin stretched too tight over its frame, slick with water. It had no eyes, just a smooth, pale face, the skin where its mouth should have been twitching as it breathed. Harding took a step back. Caldwell, however, didn't move. This is what happens, he said, his voice even, when someone isn't where they're supposed to be. The thing shifted, water dripping from its elongated limbs. It was waiting for Caldwell. Harding's grip tightened around the pocket watch. 2:08 a.m. A single minute left. Caldwell turned back toward the water. His movements were unhurried, as if he had already accepted what was about to happen. The ship's lights flickered, the fog thickened. The figures on the deck remained motionless, their faces unreadable. The thing standing on the pier didn't react to Harding or Finch. It only watched Caldwell. It had come to collect him. Caldwell exhaled softly. I tried to stay, he admitted. Tried to outrun it. But some things don't let go. He turned, meeting Harding's gaze. It's not just the ship, it's the place. Harding frowned. What do you mean? Caldwell looked down at the watch in Harding's hand. His expression softened just for a moment. You'll see. The watch ticked again. 2:07 a.m. Caldwell stepped forward. The thing waiting for him twitched, its mouthless face shifting. As Caldwell moved, so did it, its arms reaching, its long fingers curling. Finch took a step back. Jesus! The moment Caldwell reached the edge of the pier, the ship's horn sounded one last time. He paused and looked at Harding again, then he stepped forward and vanished. The thing went with him, pulled backward into the fog, its form twisting as it sank beneath the surface. The ship's lights flickered once, then it was gone. Silence. The fog began to thin, rolling back toward the river. The pier was empty again. There was no ship, no figures on the deck, and no Caldwell. Harding exhaled slowly, his fingers uncurling from the pocket watch. The time had stopped. 2:07 a.m. Finch let out a shaky breath. What the hell just happened? Harding didn't answer because he wasn't sure. The watch in his hand was still warm. The pier was still intact, with no sign that anything had ever been there at all. But as Harding looked out over the water, a terrible thought settled into his mind. Caldwell had called it the place. Not just the ship, not just the moment, but the place itself. Harding tightened his grip on the watch. Something told me this wasn't over. Not yet. Part 6. Harding stared at the empty river. The fog had thinned, the ship was gone, and so was Caldwell. The pier still felt wrong. Finch exhaled sharply beside him, rubbing his arms as if shaking off a deep chill. That just happened, right? I didn't imagine that. Harding flexed his fingers around the pocket watch, the cool metal against his palm, the only proof that any of this had been real. The watch hadn't moved since Caldwell disappeared, 2:07 a.m. Time had stopped the second Caldwell was taken back. Harding forced himself to turn away from the water. Dwelling on it wouldn't change anything that had happened. He gestured to Finch. Come on, we're getting out of here. The drive back was silent. Harding kept his grip firm on the steering wheel, his mind racing through every angle, every piece of evidence. None of it added up. Caldwell had reappeared. The ship had manifested out of nowhere. The thing that had crawled onto the pier. Harding gritted his teeth. Some things didn't belong in the world as he understood it. He'd been in homicide for years and had seen brutal crime scenes, bodies torn apart in ways that haunted him long after the cases closed. But this wasn't something he could explain away. And worse, it wasn't over. Finch tapped his fingers against his knees, breaking the silence. So, what now? Harding didn't answer right away. His thumb ran across the pocket watch, feeling the smooth metal beneath his skin. He had a bad feeling. Caldwell had called it the place. Not just the ship, not just the time, the place itself. Harding's grip tightened. Whatever happened at Pier 54, whatever force had pulled Caldwell back, there was no guarantee it was done with him. By the time Harding got home, the weight of exhaustion had settled deep into his bones. He tossed his keys onto the counter, shrugged off his jacket, and sat heavily on the couch. The pocket watch was still in his hand. He stared at it momentarily, then slowly reached for his phone. The clock on the screen read 2:06 a.m. His stomach clenched. That wasn't right. It had been past 3 when he left the pier. He checked again. 2:06 a.m., the same time, 1 minute before Caldwell had vanished. Harding swallowed hard, an icy dread creeping up his spine. The watch was still frozen at 2:07, but time itself, everything around him, was shifting backward. His apartment was too quiet. Not city quiet, not the usual late-night stillness of a place winding down for the night. Something was missing. Harding stood slowly. The streetlights outside flickered. He moved to the window, peering out onto the sidewalk below. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The same parked cars and closed storefronts sat in the distance, bathed in shadow. Then he saw them. Figures standing on the corner, unmoving, not looking at anything in particular, just there. His mouth went dry. They weren't people. Not really. Harding stepped back from the window. The watch ticked. Not forward. Not backward. Just once. A hollow, metallic sound, like something letting go. The apartment lights flickered, the hum of the refrigerator faltered, and then cut out entirely. Harding's phone screen dimmed and shut off completely. He wasn't alone. His hand moved to his gun, but he didn't draw it, not yet. The sound of footsteps, steady and unhurried, drifted from the hallway, and they were coming closer. He was confident the door to his apartment was locked, but the footsteps didn't stop. They passed right through the threshold and kept coming. Harding turned. A man stood in his living room, not Caldwell, but someone else. He was dressed in the same style, from the same era. Harding knew that face. He had seen it in the archives in the old photos. It was Henry Vaughn, the dock worker who had disappeared from Pier 54 in 1913. The man's expression was blank and unreadable. Harding didn't move, didn't breathe. Vaughn lifted his hand and pointed to the pocket watch. Harding's fingers curled tighter around it. The ticking started again. Before his eyes, the clock on the wall, his normal everyday clock, shifted. It now displayed 2:07 a.m., the exact moment Caldwell had vanished. Time was looping. Harding took a slow step back. The walls of his apartment seemed farther away now, stretching as if the space itself was pulling him somewhere else. Vaughn lowered his hand and spoke. His voice was wrong, not distorted, not inhuman, just hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep under the ocean. "You don't belong here." Harding clenched his jaw, replying, "Neither do you." Vaughn blinked as if the answer surprised him. Then slowly, so slowly, it made Harding's stomach turn. He smiled. It was a knowing smile, as if he understood something Harding didn't, like he had been here before. The walls of the apartment shuddered. The window rattled in its frame. The lights flickered again, this time staying out. Then he heard the sound of a foghorn, distant but growing closer. Harding's grip tightened on the watch, because now he understood. This wasn't about Caldwell. This wasn't about one man disappearing or even the ship itself. It was the place. Something beneath Pier 54. Something pulling people back. Vaughn took a step closer. His smile widened. Harding's vision swam. His body lurched forward, like something was pulling him back too. The clock on the wall flickered. 2:06 a.m. and dropping. Part 7. Harding's stomach churned as the world around him tilted. Not physically, but in a way he couldn't quite explain. Vaughn didn't move, he just stood there, watching, the weight of his gaze unbearable. The foghorn groaned again, closer this time. "What do you want?" Harding asked, his voice tight with tension. Vaughn's expression didn't change. "You shouldn't have taken it." Harding's fingers curled around the pocket watch. "It was his." Vaughn continued, voice flat, emotionless. "And now it's yours." A cold pressure built in Harding's chest. "Caldwell's gone. Watch doesn't mean anything now." Vaughn tilted his head as if listening to something just beyond the range of human hearing. "You think this is about him?" Harding didn't answer. Suddenly, he wasn't sure. Vaughn's gaze flicked toward the window, and the air in the apartment felt wrong. Not thick, not heavy, just unstable. The walls no longer felt solid, like they could dissolve if he reached out. "You kept it," Vaughn said softly. "That's all it takes." Harding glanced down. The watch sat in his palm, its gold casing, reflecting the dim light. The hands were moving again, backward, 2:05 a.m. A deep sense of unease settled over him. "Give it back," Vaughn murmured. Harding's grip tightened around the pocket watch. It was the only thing tethering him to the reality of what had happened. If he let it go... He shook his head. No. Vaughn's expression didn't change, but something around him did. The shadows in the corner of the apartment deepened. The hum of the city outside dulled to an almost imperceptible murmur. It was as if the world was fading, peeling away. "You don't have a choice," Vaughn said. The foghorn roared, impossibly close. Then the floor beneath Harding shifted. Not the normal movement of an old apartment settling, but a lurch as if the entire building had moved. Harding's apartment was changing. The walls darkened, the paint peeling in uneven strips. The floor lost its stability, boards warping under his feet. The air smelled of salt, rusted iron, and damp wood. The apartment was becoming something else, something older, something wrong. Vaughn stepped forward. The light in the room flickered, not from the ceiling, but from outside, as if the city's glow had been replaced by something dimmer. Harding didn't need to look to know what was happening. The apartment wasn't in New York anymore. Or rather, New York wasn't here anymore. Vaughn's voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "You should have left it." The walls shuddered. The ceiling groaned. For the briefest moment, Harding saw through them not wood and plaster, but metal. Rivets and beams. A long, endless corridor lined with bolted doors, faint, flickering lanterns, and water, just beyond the walls, waiting to rush in. A ship. Harding's stomach twisted. "No," he murmured, but it was already happening. He moved fast, lunging for the door and twisting the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Vaughn didn't react, he simply watched, standing unnaturally still as Harding yanked at the handle. The door should have led to the hallway outside his apartment, but when Harding glanced through the peephole, he couldn't believe his eyes. Water. Not a flood, not a leak, just a wall of water, stretching into the distance. No surface, no bottom, just an endless black abyss. The foghorn bellowed. A vibration ran through the floor, a distant, echoing groan. Harding had heard that sound before, in his dreams, in the recording of ships breaking apart under pressure. He turned back to Vaughn, his voice tight. "What is this?" Vaughn didn't blink. "You know what it is." Harding's fingers curled into a fist. "How do I stop it?" For the first time, Vaughn smiled. "You don't." The room lurched again. Harding lost his balance, stumbling back against the couch. The walls continued to shift, the wood splintering, darkening, transforming. A hallway stretched before him where there had been none. The same long, narrow one he had glimpsed before, lined with bolted doors. One of them was open. A single lantern swayed beside it, casting a weak golden glow. Vaughn turned toward it. It's time. Harding's jaw clenched. He had seconds to decide. He could let this happen, let whatever force was trying to pull him back win, or he could fight it. He tightened his grip on the watch. The hands were still moving. 2:04 a.m. 2 minutes until... what? Until it vanished? Until it became Vaughn? Or worse, until it was dragged to wherever Caldwell had gone? The walls groaned again. Water leaked through the seams, dripping onto the floor. Harding didn't have much time, and he wasn't going quietly. Part 8. Harding took a slow, measured breath and weighed his options. The ship, the place, was trying to take him, the pocket watch in his hand counting down, dragging him minute by minute towards something he wasn't meant to survive. But he wasn't going to just stand there and let it happen. The open doorway loomed at the end of the shifting corridor, the flickering lantern casting shadows in the damp air. The hallway itself felt unnatural. The walls breathed. and the wood beneath his feet groaned as if it remembered what it had once been. The watch ticked. 2:03 a.m. Harding exhaled sharply. No! Vaughn tilted his head slightly, the movement too deliberate. You don't have a choice. Harding's fingers flexed around the pocket watch. He forced himself to take in everything. The shifting walls, the warping space, the creeping sense of water pressing in from the edges. There had to be a way out, a real way out. Vaughn studied him for a moment, then took a slow step forward. None of us did, he murmured. Harding stood motionless. For the first time, he saw something under Vaughn's expression, something like regret. The watch ticked again, 2:02 a.m. Harding turned, his eyes scanning the distorted remnants of his apartment. He could still see it, his couch, his bookshelf, the window overlooking the street, but the edges were fraying, unraveling into the dim corridor beyond. If you let this go on, if the countdown hit 0, would there be anything left? He gritted his teeth. He had to break it, whatever this was. You stayed, he said, his voice level, didn't you? Vaughn hesitated, and Harding took a step closer. That's what happened to you. You didn't disappear, you stayed. The shadows in the hallway deepened. The walls groaned under the pressure. Vaughn's jaw tensed. I wasn't supposed to, he admitted. Harding clenched his fist. But you fought it. I thought I did, murmured Vaughn. His eyes darkened. This place doesn't let go, it just waits. The watch ticked, 2:01 a.m. The lantern by the open door flickered, casting an eerie light. The hallway was shifting again, the doorway pulling further back, as if it were drawing him in, beckoning him to chase it. Harding knew that if he went through, he wouldn't come back. His grip on the watch tightened. I'm not going with you, he said, his voice firm. Vaughn's expression remained neutral, but something behind his eyes shifted. You already are, he said, his tone almost final. The foghorn bellowed, the pressure in the air changing with it. The pocket watch ticked, and then everything stopped. Silence. Not the kind of silence Harding was used to. The quiet hum of the city at night or the distant murmur of life beyond its walls. This was absolute. He glanced around. The walls stopped moving. The air had stilled, frozen in place. Even the flickering lantern outside the open door was gone still, its flame suspended in time, unmoving. And Vaughn wasn't there anymore. The pocket watch was cold now, and the hands had stopped. 2 a.m. A full stop. Harding tensed. This was his chance. If he was ever going to break free, it had to be now. He stepped toward the window. The glass was distorted, rippling like the surface of a deep lake. He could still make out the street beyond, familiar and real, but it wasn't connected to where he was anymore. Not fully. He needed to reattach himself to his own time, his reality. Harding lifted the watch. It had started this. It had counted him down, tried to drag him to a place he was never meant to see. And it had the power to take him. If it did, it also had the power to undo. He didn't think or hesitate. He gripped the pocket watch in both hands and snapped it shut. The moment the latch clicked, the world lurched. Harding staggered back as the room twisted, folding in on itself, raveling into something else. The hallway collapsed. The open door vanished. The walls of his apartment shuddered, then a snap. Like a rubber band pulled too tight, suddenly letting go. And then it was just his apartment again. No corridors, no lanterns, no Vaughn. Just four walls, a locked door, and a city that never stopped moving. Harding glanced at the watch in his hand. It was dead. No movement, no ticking. Just a useless hunk of gold. He loosened his grip, letting it drop onto the coffee table. He didn't need it anymore. He sat heavily on the couch, staring at nothing. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, maybe minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually his phone buzzed. The screen was back to normal. Time was moving forward again. Finch's name lit up on the screen. Harding picked up. "Jesus, man, I've been calling you for hours," Finch said, his voice strained. "What the hell happened?" Harding rubbed a hand over his face. He didn't know where to start, so he settled for the only thing that mattered. "It's over." Finch hesitated. "You sure?" Harding looked at the watch, unmoving on the table. The timepiece that had once dictated his fate was now nothing more than an object. It had no power, no pull. The countdown had ceased. Harding exhaled. Yeah, I'm sure." Outside, the city continued as it always had. Traffic lights flickered from red to green. People walked the sidewalks, unaware how close one man had come to slipping through the cracks of time itself. Harding stood, stretching his stiff muscles. His body still felt off, like it was recovering from a distance he couldn't explain. But here he was, and that was enough. He picked up the pocket watch one last time, studying its blank, silent face. Then he tossed it into the trash. It didn't belong to him, and it never would. The case was officially closed. Harding had filed the necessary reports. An unidentified male had been struck by a vehicle in Times Square with no next of kin and no known history. The body had disappeared under unexplained circumstances, but without evidence of foul play, it was written off as a procedural anomaly. Paperwork moved through the system. The watch was no longer in his possession, and his apartment remained exactly as it always had been. But that didn't mean he was done with it. Some things he realized didn't end. They just lingered. It started with small things, a sensation, a flicker at the edge of his vision, the faintest impression of movement when nothing was there. But it was worse at night. He'd wake up at odd hours, 2:07 a.m., without fail. And when he did, the air would feel wrong. He barely slept, and when he did, it made little difference. Finch noticed. "You look like hell," he said one afternoon, stirring his coffee. "You getting any shut-eye at all?" Harding, he didn't answer. He took a slow sip from his cup, watching the street outside. Finch exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Look, man, I get it. It's the weirdest case I've ever seen, too. But it's over. Caldwell's gone, Vaughn's gone. You broke whatever the hell was happening." Harding nodded. He knew that, and yet... "Did I?" he muttered. Finch frowned. "What do you mean?" Harding's grip tightened around the ceramic mug. "I stopped it from taking me. But whatever it is, it's still there." Pier 54 wasn't just a place. He understood it was a door, which meant that someday, somehow, it could open again. Harding stood by his window that night, staring out at the street. Outside in the city, life went on as usual. But he couldn't. He wasn't normal, not anymore. Something had changed, even if no one else could see it. Even if he couldn't explain it, the feeling never left. He felt as though he was still on the edge of something, a fraction of a step from slipping away entirely. He turned away from the window. His apartment was quiet. Too quiet. His gaze drifted to the trash can near his desk, to the thing he had thrown away. The pocket watch. It wasn't ticking. It wasn't counting down. But it was still there, waiting. Harding exhaled slowly. Maybe Finch was right. Perhaps it was over. Or maybe some doors never really close.
And that was The Disappearance of Daniel Caldwell by A.G. Greene, as performed by my inestimable cohort, Otis Jiry. After hearing that, my friend, I think I'll start double-checking my calendar every day.
Well, sometimes the things that we think we know are the very things that betray us. Time, memories, they bend and shift in ways we'll never fully understand.
1 minute you're living in your world, and the next you're somewhere else entirely. Our next tale takes us into the mind, where darkness isn't just something you can see, but something that takes root in the very way we think and feel. In it, we'll explore the terrifying consequences of erasing what makes us human. Performed by yours truly, this is The Blackout Experiment by Craig Groshek. Part 1. I was told it would change the way we understood human consciousness. That was how Dr. Mercer pitched it to us, and for a while, I believed him. The study was called the Blackout Exposure Experiment, though the official documents never gave it a name. The premise was simple: total sensory deprivation in controlled cycles to rewire the brain's relationship with sleep. If successful, it would eliminate fatigue entirely. No more exhaustion, no more wasted hours lost to unconsciousness, a permanent waking state. There were 5 of us. We had all been carefully selected, an ideal mix of scientific backgrounds, strong cognitive endurance, and open-mindedness. Miriam Patel, a molecular biologist, was the most pragmatic of us. Viktor Petrovic, a software engineer, saw it as the next step in human evolution. Rebecca Clark, our neuroscientist, was fascinated by how the process would rewire brain activity. Terry Holloway had once studied dream psychology before dropping out of academia. And me, Daniel Grayson, a psychology grad student who had no illusions about what I was getting into. At least, not then. Dr. Silas Mercer was the kind of man whose reputation preceded him. Some called him a brilliant innovator, others a mad scientist. He had theories about human consciousness that were dismissed by mainstream academia. According to him, sleep was a biological defect, a leftover mechanism from an evolutionary stage we had outgrown. He was certain the brain could be trained to function without rest, without limitation. His methods, however, were classified. That should have been the first warning sign. We arrived at the facility in the early morning, taken by an unmarked transport van through a back road in rural Montana. It had been raining, and the dirt road leading to the site was a mess of deep tracks and muddy puddles. When the van finally stopped, we stepped out in front of what looked like nothing more than a concrete wall jutting out of the hillside. There were no windows, no signage, just a steel-reinforced door embedded in the stone. A keypad beeped, a mechanical hiss followed, and the door swung open. Dr. Mercer led us inside. "This way," he said. Beyond the threshold, the air changed. It was as if we had stepped into a vacuum. The walls were made of bare concrete, smooth and featureless, stretching into a long, sterile corridor that descended at a slight incline. The further we went, the more it felt like we were stepping away from the world entirely. "This facility," Mercer explained as we walked, "was originally a military research station, abandoned before completion. Perfectly secure, completely cut off from external signals, no outside interference." "How deep are we?" Miriam asked. "Nearly 200 feet underground." Victor let out a low whistle. "That's one hell of a bunker." Mercer gave a slight nod, but offered nothing more. We passed through a second reinforced door and emerged into the main chamber. The living quarters were more comfortable than expected. 6 rooms branching from a central common area, complete with a stocked kitchen, lounge, and an adjacent research lab. At the far end, a steel-reinforced corridor led to the blackout chambers, individual rooms designed for complete sensory deprivation. There are no clocks, Rebecca noted. No windows. How do we keep track of time? You don't, Mercer said. That's part of the process. No one questioned it. We were here to push the boundaries of human cognition, and to do that, we had to let go of conventional frameworks. No external markers of time, no distractions. We'll begin the first Blackout session this evening, Mercer continued. For now, settle in. You'll be here for a month. It wasn't until he said it out loud that the reality of our isolation truly set in. We started the first Blackout cycle that evening. Each of us was assigned to a sealed chamber where we would remain for 6-hour periods of total darkness and silence. The rooms were small, featureless, and soundproof, with no light sources whatsoever, not even the glow of a power indicator. Blackout exposure forces the brain to recalibrate its sensory processing, Mercer explained before sealing the doors. In time, your mind will adapt. The first session was uneventful. Lying in complete darkness, I felt like I was floating in empty space. No sound, no motion, no sense of time. The first hour or two, my mind wandered, and then it simply stopped. My thoughts became detached, my awareness drifting without structure. Then, the session ended. The doors unsealed, the lights returned, and I felt fine. Better than fine. By the third day, we were all experiencing profound clarity. No one felt tired, no grogginess, no exhaustion. Our minds were sharp and focused. Even our moods were elevated. It's like being hyper-aware all the time, Victor said. I expected to feel some level of fatigue, Rebecca admitted, reviewing our EEG scans, but we're seeing no drop in cognitive function. Miriam, always the skeptic, remained cautious. It's only been a few days. We need to see how this progresses. Terry, however, was the first to express discomfort. Something feels off, he said over breakfast on day 4. You feeling side effects? I asked. No, that's the problem, he said. It's not natural to be awake this long and feel nothing. We should feel tired, but we don't. Victor scoffed. That's the point. Terry shook his head. I don't mean just physically, I mean up here. He tapped the side of his temple. It's like I lost something. I just can't put my finger on it. Dr. Mercer dismissed his concerns. Your brain is adjusting. Sleep is nothing more than an evolutionary flaw. You'll realize soon enough how much better off you are without it. His words were confident, but something in his tone said otherwise. On day 5, Rebecca made an observation. Our EEG results are unusual, she said, frowning at her screen. We're all showing high activity in the theta range. What does that mean? I asked. She hesitated. Theta waves occur during REM sleep. We shouldn't be producing them if we're awake. Victor leaned over. But we are awake. Exactly, she said. Somehow our brains are processing as if we're dreaming, but we're fully conscious. That shouldn't be possible. She turned to Mercer for an explanation. His response was simple. This is exactly what I'd hoped for. Part 2. By day 6, it was clear that we weren't just adapting to the blackout exposure. We were thriving in it. The energy wasn't fading. We weren't experiencing withdrawal symptoms from sleep. If anything, we felt sharper and more awake. Even small details such as sounds, textures, and colors seemed heightened. Miriam, who had been skeptical at first, admitted she was starting to believe the experiment might actually work. We're maintaining full cognitive function without sleep, she said during one of our daily check-ins. And I don't mean just staying awake. I mean we aren't experiencing any negative side effects. No irritability, no lapses in focus, If anything, we're performing better than before. Rebecca nodded, scrolling through our EEG data. It's like our brains have found a new operating state, one that maintains REM cycle processing without shutting down the body. Victor grinned. Mercer cracked it. He actually cracked it. Even I had to admit it was incredible, but Terry remained uneasy. At breakfast on day 7, he voiced his concerns again. Has anyone noticed, I don't know, gaps in time? We all looked at him. What do you mean? I asked. Terry rubbed his face. I mean, I'll be doing something like reading or writing notes, and then suddenly I'm somewhere else, like I lost time. But I know I didn't lose time. I just don't remember moving. Victor scoffed. You're overthinking it. We don't sleep anymore, so your sense of time is adjusting. Terry shook his head. No, it's more than that. It's like, I know I was sitting in the lounge, but now I'm in my room, and I don't remember walking there. I glanced at Rebecca. Have you noticed anything like that in the data? She hesitated. No memory gaps, but our brainwave readings have been strange. She turned her laptop screen toward us. We're all showing theta wave activity, which, as I said before, only occurs during REM sleep. But the weird part, the spikes don't line up. She scrolled through the charts, pointing to anomalies. Each of us is experiencing these fluctuations at different times, as if... She hesitated. As if what? Miriam asked. Rebecca exhaled. As if we're dreaming, but not at the same time. There was a silence. That's not possible, I said. We're awake. I know. Victor waved a hand dismissively. It's just the brain compensating for the loss of sleep. It's adjusting. Terry shook his head again. Or it's losing something it needs. That night, during the blackout session, something changed. I was in my chamber, lying still in the perfect darkness, when I felt a shift. Not a sound or a movement, but rather a change in the feeling of the room, as if the space around me had subtly rearranged itself. I couldn't see or hear anything, but I felt it. Then I heard a whisper. It was so faint that I almost thought I imagined it, a distant murmur just outside the chamber walls. Then it grew closer, someone whispering my name. I jolted upright, but there was nothing. No door creaking open, no movement in the dark, just silence. The session ended shortly after, and I rushed out into the main corridor. Miriam was already there, looking pale. You heard it too, she said. I nodded. A whisper, someone saying my name. Victor and Rebecca exchanged glances. I heard movement, Victor admitted. Terry stepped forward. I heard my name too. For the first time since the experiment started, Dr. Mercer looked concerned. He studied us for a moment, then gave a slow nod. The brain, he said carefully, compensates for the loss of sensory input by filling in gaps. It creates patterns out of randomness. You may begin experiencing auditory hallucinations, but I assure you it's expected. I wasn't convinced. Terry frowned. Then why didn't you mention this before? Mercer gave a slight smile. Because it's temporary. Once your brains fully adjust, the illusions will stop. None of us responded. Something was happening, something Mercer hadn't predicted. By day 8, the unease had set in. We were still functioning, still hyper-aware, sharp, and energetic, but something felt wrong. Miriam described it as nagging sensation of displacement. I feel like I'm in the wrong place, she said at breakfast, like I'm not supposed to be here. Victor dismissed it. That's just the sleep withdrawal talking. But Rebecca wasn't so sure. "I ran the numbers again," she said, gesturing to her data, "and something doesn't add up." She pulled up our movement records, a system that tracked our location within the facility. "This is the common area," she said, pointing at the logs. "This is our lounge. These are our sleeping quarters." She tapped a point on the screen. "And this is nowhere." I leaned in. "What do you mean?" She zoomed in. "These timestamps show us moving through a non-existent location, a place that doesn't match any mapped area of the facility." Miriam looked unsettled. "That's not possible." "I know," Rebecca said, "but it's happening." That night, I barely lasted 5 minutes in the blackout chamber before panic set in. The darkness felt different, as if the space itself had expanded around me. Then, the whispering returned. Not outside the chamber this time. No, this time it was inside. I bolted upright. "Who's there?" At first, there was no reply, and then a breath. Right beside me. I scrambled for the door, slamming my fists against it. "Let me out!" I screamed. Moments later, the hatch unsealed, and I stumbled into the corridor. Victor, Miriam, and Rebecca were already there, looking shaken. All of us had heard it. Then we noticed Terry was missing. Part 3. Terry was gone, vanished without a trace. At first, we assumed he was just somewhere else in the facility. Maybe he'd woken up early and wandered off, or perhaps he was waiting for us in the lounge. But when we checked every room, he wasn't there. We searched the common area, the kitchen, the labs, and even the storage rooms. Nothing. His personal items were still in his quarters. His clothes, notebooks, and toiletries were all untouched. He was simply gone. Rebecca pulled up the security logs. "This is the last recorded movement from Terry," she said, pointing at the screen. The footage showed his chamber door opening at the end of the last blackout session. He stepped into the corridor, rubbing his eyes, a completely normal exit. But then, one frame later, he was gone, not walking away or turning a corner. 1 second he was standing there, and the next, the hallway was empty. Rebecca's voice was unsteady. "That's not possible." Victor shook his head. "Maybe it's a glitch." Rebecca rewound the footage and played it again, with the same result. Miriam exhaled sharply. "We should be panicking, right? I feel like we should be panicking." "We are panicking," I muttered. "We just don't know what to do about it." Dr. Mercer sat calmly at the table, watching us with carefully measured patience. He spoke only when we all turned to him. "There is no cause for alarm," he said smoothly. "I'm sure Terry is fine." I stared at him. "Fine? Did you not just see what we saw?" Mercer folded his hands. "Human perception is deeply flawed. The absence of a subject does not indicate an anomaly. It merely indicates an incomplete understanding of the system in which the subject exists." Rebecca's jaw clenched. "You're saying this makes sense to you?" Mercer smiled slightly. "I'm saying your expectations of space and time are limiting your ability to understand what's happening." No one responded. He stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his lab coat. "Continue the experiment. Everything is proceeding as expected." Then he walked out. Terry wasn't the only thing missing. By day 9, we began noticing small changes in the facility itself. The hallways felt longer. The door to the research lab was an inch to the left from where I remembered it. Miriam swore that a stainless steel countertop in the kitchen had been a wooden one the day before. Rebecca tested it by drawing small X's in chalk on the floor at key locations. By the next morning, they were gone. Victor tried to rationalize it. We're overworked. No sleep means faulty memory processing. We're just misremembering things. I wanted to believe him, but it wasn't just the environment that was changing. It was us. On day 10, Miriam woke up screaming. Rebecca and I ran into her room, where we found her standing against the wall, clutching at her arms. "What happened?" I asked. She turned to us, her face pale. "I looked in the mirror," she whispered. We followed her gaze to the small bathroom mirror above the sink. It was cracked, spiderweb fractures crawling across the glass. I hesitated. "And?" Miriam swallowed. "My reflection. It didn't move with me." She glanced at the mirror again. It was half a second behind. Victor let out a nervous chuckle. "That's ridiculous." Miriam's voice was flat. "Then go look." Victor hesitated. None of us stepped forward. That night we heard the whispers again. At first, they were outside the walls, faint and muffled. Then, they were in the rooms. This time they weren't saying our names. They were laughing. By day 11, Rebecca had a breakthrough. She stormed into the common area, laptop in hand. "I've been cross-referencing the movement logs with our brainwave data," she said. "There's a pattern." She pulled up a chart. EEG readings from all 5 of us. 4 of them, mine, Miriam's, Victor's, and her own, looked similar. Spikes of unusual theta wave activity. But Terry's chart was different. It stopped. The last recorded spike was the moment he disappeared. Victor frowned. "What does that mean?" Rebecca hesitated. "It means his brain activity didn't just stop recording." She pointed at the chart. "It stopped, like he was never there at all." That night, I lasted all of 3 minutes in the chamber before something went wrong, before the breathing started, right beside me. I shot up. "Who's there?" In response, there was a whisper directly in my ear. "It's cold here," it rasped. "Daniel, where are you?" I nearly choked. The voice was Terry's. Before I could even react, it spoke again. "I can see you, but you can't see me." I lunged for the door, slamming my fists against it. "Let me out! Please! Help!" The hatch unsealed and I stumbled into the corridor. As before, Victor, Miriam, and Rebecca were already there, and they'd all heard the voice too. Terry's voice. This time, the doctor wasn't with us. We found him in his office, staring at a monitor filled with static. I stormed in first. "What the hell is happening, Mercer?" He didn't look up. "Matter is shifting," he said simply. I clenched my fists. "What on earth are you talking about?" Mercer finally turned. His eyes were calm. "It means," he said, "that this world is no longer stable for you." Part 4. Victor was the first to react. He grabbed Mercer by the front of his coat and slammed him against the desk. "What the hell does that mean? What do you mean, this world isn't stable?" Mercer didn't resist. He simply stared at Victor, his face utterly composed. "The experiment is proceeding as expected," he said. Victor's grip tightened. "Terry is gone. Our reflections aren't moving right. The halls are changing. Nothing about this is expected." Mercer gave a slow, almost congratulatory nod. "That means you're beginning to see it." Miriam backed away. "See what?" Mercer exhaled, brushing Victor's hands away and straightening his coat. Then he finally spoke plainly. "The blackouts were never designed to eliminate sleep," he said. "They were designed to sever your dependency on it, to break the cycle your mind has been trapped in for your entire life." Rebecca stared at him. You mean our biological need for sleep? I mean, he said, your connection to this reality. No one spoke for a long moment. Victor was the first to laugh, a short, humorless sound. You're telling me you're trying to make us what exactly? Exist without reality? Mercer tilted his head. I'm telling you that reality is a construct tied to sleep, and that you have spent the past 10 days unbinding yourselves from it. A silence fell over the room. I swallowed. That's impossible. Mercer's lips curved into something resembling amusement. Then why is Terry gone? A chill ran through me. Mercer gestured toward Rebecca's screen. Why do your movement logs record you entering non-existent locations? Why does your reflection lag? Why do the walls move? He leaned in slightly. His voice dropped to a whisper. Why do you hear voices in the dark? Miriam shook her head, backing up. No, this is just psychological deterioration, sleep deprivation. Your experiment is making us hallucinate. Mercer smiled faintly. That would be easier, wouldn't it? I clenched my fists. If you're telling the truth, then why are you fine? I'm not the one undergoing the experiment, Mercer said simply. Rebecca narrowed her eyes. You haven't been sleeping, though. Not once. Mercer met her gaze without hesitation. I haven't needed to for a long time. The way he said it sent something cold slithering down my spine. We left his office after that, more disturbed than before. Rebecca tried to find answers in the data. Victor paced endlessly through the halls, measuring the angles with a notepad and a ruler. Miriam barely spoke. And I couldn't stop hearing Terry's voice. Every time I closed my eyes for even a second, I heard it. It's cold here. Daniel, where are you? I can see you, but you can't see me. I started keeping all the lights on when I was in my room. I refused to enter the blackout chambers again. Then, on day 12, I woke up to something touching me. The room was pitch black when I jerked awake. It was too dark, more than it should have been. And then, just outside my field of vision, I felt something move. I lunged for the light switch, and when the glow filled the room, there was nothing there. But the blankets where I had been laying were still sinking, still shifting, as if something had just been sitting beside me. I scrambled back against the wall and noticed the door to my room had moved. It was barely noticeable, just by a few inches, but I was sure of it. By day 13, we were barely speaking to one another. Victor muttered about non-Euclidean structures and kept mapping the shifting hallways. Miriam avoided reflective surfaces. Rebecca spent hours staring at the security footage of Terry disappearing, rewinding and replaying it in an attempt to catch something she missed. As for me, I started looking into dark corners. The whispers were louder now, and they weren't just Terry's voice anymore. There were others. I started covering my ears, stuffing paper towels into them just to dull the noise. It didn't help. On day 14, I found Victor talking to someone who wasn't there. I had been walking to the lounge via the corridor when I heard him whispering, low and urgent, and froze. And the angles are wrong, but I know what they mean now, Victor was saying. 2.7 degrees off, that's the difference. That's the ripping factor. But that's the key, isn't it? Isn't it? There was a long silence, and then he laughed, a quiet, knowing sound. Those are the degrees of ripping, he continued. I understand now. Unbelievably, I heard someone whisper back, and my blood ran cold. It was distorted and broken, inhuman. I took a step forward. "Victor?" He turned toward me, grinning ear to ear. "I know how to get out," he said. Part 5. Victor's smile was wrong, the kind that didn't belong on someone sane. It stretched too wide, teeth barely visible behind parted lips, and it didn't reach his eyes. "I know how to get out," he repeated, his voice lighter this time, almost gleeful. I took a step back. "Victor, who were you talking to?" He tilted his head, blinking slowly, like I had just asked him something absurd. "Did you know that when you remove an essential structural element from an enclosed space, the space corrects itself? That it fills the gap with something else?" A shiver ran through me. "What are you talking about?" Victor turned his palm upward as if presenting some invisible truth. "Terry left a gap. The structure had to balance itself again." I swallowed. "Victor, they told me how to get out," he interrupted. "It's inside us. We just have to cut deep enough." Then he plunged his fingers into his own abdomen. I screamed before I even realized I was doing it. Victor didn't. He pushed his hand deeper, twisting his fingers through his flesh like he was searching for something. Blood soaked his shirt, dripping down onto the floor in heavy splatters. His face remained eerily serene, eyes flicking up toward mine as he dug deeper. I staggered back. "Jesus Christ, Victor, stop!" But he didn't stop. His smile widened. "I can feel it," he murmured. "The doorway." I turned to run, to get Rebecca, Miriam, or Mercer, but as I did, I heard him gasp. Not in pain, but in relief. "I see it now," he whispered. When I looked back, he was gone. Only the pool of blood remained. Miriam and Rebecca found me standing in the corridor, shaking. I barely remember how I explained what had happened. Rebecca refused to believe me until she saw the blood on the floor. Miriam, however, turned pale. He was just talking to me an hour ago." "Not anymore," I rasped. We stood in silence for a long moment. Then Rebecca turned and marched toward Mercer's office. She slammed the door open without knocking. Mercer was exactly where we had last left him, sitting at his desk, watching the static-filled monitor. He didn't look surprised. "Where did he go?" Rebecca snapped. Mercer slowly turned his chair toward us. "Where did who go?" Miriam's hands balled into fists. "You know who. Victor." Mercer leaned back slightly, exhaling. "This is what happens when a subject attempts to force an exit before full transition," he said. The casual way he said it made my skin crawl. Rebecca took a sharp step forward. "You mean he's dead?" Mercer shook his head. "Not dead, just elsewhere." Miriam trembled with anger. "You knew this would happen, didn't you? You knew what this experiment really was from the beginning." Mercer was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I told you," he said. "Sleep is an anchor. You have been severing yourselves from reality, and now reality is severing itself from you." "How many?" Rebecca whispered. "How many test subjects came before us?" Mercer smiled faintly. "None that you would remember." I felt sick. I backed away from his desk, my vision tilting slightly as my balance wavered. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, hadn't slept, hadn't dreamed. I felt disconnected, like my limbs were moving out of sync with my thoughts. Miriam noticed. "Daniel?" I blinked at her. She looked too far away, like she was standing across an impossible distance, even though she was only a foot from me. Mercer watched me carefully. "You feel it now, don't you?" he murmured. "The shift." I didn't answer because I did. I felt it. The wrongness of the space around me. The sensation that I was somewhere I shouldn't be. And for the first time, I knew that I wasn't going to leave this place. None of us were. We didn't return to our rooms that night. We stayed in the common area, huddled in silence, too afraid to be alone. Mercer didn't stop us. He just watched, his expression unchanged, like he had already seen this unfold before. The lights flickered once, twice, and then, I swear to God, the walls moved. Miriam shuddered. "We have to get out of here." Rebecca turned toward me. "Daniel?" I looked up. Her face was tense. "Victor was wrong," she said. I swallowed. "About what?" She hesitated. Then quietly she said, "It's not inside us." She glanced toward the hallway at the Blackout chambers. "It's in the dark." Part 6. I don't know how long we stayed there, huddled in the common area. An hour? 12 hours? Time had lost its meaning. All I remember is that at some point the entire facility seemed to shudder, like an earthquake running beneath our feet, except there was no quake, just the sensation that reality itself was tearing. Miriam trembled, hugging her knees. "We can't just sit here," she whispered. Rebecca's hands tightened around a crumpled sheet of data. "Then what do you suggest?" My throat felt raw, as though I'd been screaming for days. For all I knew, I may have been. "We need to get out," I replied. Maybe we can force the doors open." Miriam lifted her gaze. "What if we confront Mercer directly and demand he open the exits?" I thought about it. What other choice did we have? We had seen what happened to Terry, and then Victor, and we knew something dark was prowling the halls, something we couldn't see, but could feel. "All right," I said. "We go to Mercer." He wasn't in his office. The static-filled monitor was still there, buzzing faintly in the otherwise silent room, but Mercer's chair was empty. Rebecca checked every corridor, muttering under her breath, "He has to be somewhere. He wouldn't just vanish." Her voice quavered, betraying her fear. We turned one corner and found a door that hadn't existed before. A heavy, bolted steel barrier with no handle, set in a stretch of concrete wall that used to be featureless. Miriam stared at it. "We've been down this hallway 100 times. This door, it was never here." Rebecca pried at the edges. "It's locked, or sealed." I put my ear to the cold metal. No sound from within, yet somehow I knew Mercer was behind it. A flicker of motion caught my eye. The corridor was lengthening before my eyes. The far end seemed to recede like a rubber band stretching. I blinked hard. It didn't stop. "That's it," Miriam whispered, stepping back. "I'm not doing this anymore." "Miriam!" I reached out to her, but she yanked her arm away. She spun around and strode off in the opposite direction, her footsteps echoing oddly in the distorted hallway. Rebecca and I exchanged looks, then hurried after her. We found her in the kitchen, rummaging through drawers, until she seized a large butcher knife. She held it in trembling hands. I'm not doing what Victor did," she said, voice shaking. "I won't." I took a step forward, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Miriam, put the knife down." She shook her head rapidly. No, I'm not gonna cut myself open. That's insane. But if that thing, Whatever's whispering, whatever's moving the walls, if it comes for me, I want something to defend myself with." Rebecca nodded, still breathing heavily. "Fine, just be careful." We could all hear it, a soft, distant laughter rising and falling as though just beyond our vision. I couldn't tell if it was down the corridor or inside my skull. Miriam lifted the knife. "I want to find Mercer. I want him to face us and tell us how to fix this." We forced ourselves to head deeper into the facility. The halls were alien now, longer and curving in impossible ways. Angles that should have been 90 degrees felt skewed, and the overhead lights seemed dimmer, even though we hadn't touched the switches. Rebecca clutched her notebook to her chest. "Stay close. Don't let the corridor split us up." I led the way, my hand skimming the concrete wall for stability, my mind buzzing. Everything felt unmoored, as though the laws of physics had started to slip. We passed the door to the research lab. It was ajar. A faint light spilled out. Inside, we found Mercer. He was standing by a console that displayed oscillating waveforms. His back was to us. For a moment, the overhead fluorescence flickered, and it looked like Mercer's outline was flickering too, out of sync with the light. Miriam raised the knife. "What did you do to us?" He didn't turn around. "I completed the process." Rebecca moved to the side, trying to circle him. "What process? Severing us from sleep or severing us from reality?" Mercer inclined his head, but still didn't fully face us. "You misunderstand. Reality is not a monolith. It's a framework, sustained by your need for rest. Sleep is the anchor. By removing it, you have the freedom to exist beyond those boundaries." I tried to steady my breathing. "That's not freedom. We're trapped in this." He finally turned, and I saw something strange in his eyes. Something like a reflection of myself, but it was at the wrong angle, as though the inside of his pupils contained a warped mirror. "You're only trapped because you still cling to the idea that this place is real," he said. "Terry, Victor, they realized it first. They tried to break through." Miriam swallowed, the knife quivering in her hand. "What is this place, really?" Mercer's expression almost softened. "A husk, a transitional shell that crumbles once you stop believing in it." He gestured to the undulating hallway behind us. "It's already unraveling." Rebecca advanced on him, fists clenched. "How do we stop it? How do we go back?" Mercer studied her in silence. Then, with that same uncanny calm, he said, "You can't. You've already begun to slip." I felt something in my chest tighten. "There must be a way." Mercer tilted his head. "There is one, but you won't like it." Miriam took a step forward, eyes flashing. "Tell us." "You have to force yourselves into unconsciousness," Mercer said plainly. "You must sleep, however briefly. That's the only way to anchor yourselves again. But your brains have been trained to reject it. They no longer remember how." "How do we force it?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mercer stepped aside, revealing a locked medical cabinet on the far wall. "Sedatives," he said. "I prepared them just in case." Rebecca lunged for the cabinet. It was locked, but she grabbed a nearby metal stool and smashed the glass. Inside, we found vials of a clear fluid and a box of syringes. Miriam looked at Mercer suspiciously. "If you wanted us to stay awake, why even have these?" He shrugged. "Call it a failsafe, or mercy." I watched Miriam carefully draw the sedative into a syringe. The knife was on the counter now. Her hands were still shaking, but I saw a determined light in her eyes. "Daniel, are we really doing this?" Rebecca asked, her voice thin. "Do we have a choice?" I whispered back. "If we stay here, we'll disappear like the others." She nodded grimly. Miriam tested the plunger. "All right, who's first?" I met Mercer's gaze. "What about you?" He just smiled. "I have no need for sedation." I gritted my teeth. "Fine." I lay down on the exam table. Rebecca helped me roll up my sleeve and she injected the sedative. I felt a brief, sharp sting and then a cold wash spreading up my arm. Instantly, the world tilted. Light and shadows stretched, and the corners of my vision blurred. I heard Mercer's voice. It sounded muffled and distant, as though he was underwater. "Hurry. The facility won't remain stable much longer." Miriam drew up another syringe for herself. Her eyes flicked to me as my vision began to darken. I saw her lips move, but her words were lost in the roar of my own heartbeat. Then the world rippled and fell away. I woke in a hospital bed, gasping, drenched in sweat. My lungs burned, as though I'd been holding my breath for days. A bright light glared overhead. I spotted white ceiling tiles, smelled antiseptic smell of disinfectant. Somewhere, on the periphery, machines beeped softly. I blinked, disoriented. A nurse rushed in, checking my vitals and placed a hand on my forehead. She spoke to someone in the hallway, her voice urgent but muffled. A wave of relief mixed with panic surged through me. Was this real? Could it be real? My throat felt sandpaper dry. "Where?" I croaked, voice barely above a whisper. "Easy," she said, pressing a plastic cup of water to my lips. "You're in a hospital in Helena. You were found in an abandoned bunker, severely dehydrated and malnourished. You've been here for several days." I gulped the water. "Did you find anyone else with me? A woman named Miriam, or a woman named Rebecca?" The nurse's brow furrowed. "You were alone. Nobody else was there." I stared at her. "What about Dr. Silas Mercer?" She shook her head. "I'm sorry, no." Days passed. My parents arrived, weeping with relief, though they refused to talk about the details. The local authorities had apparently found me by chance. No official records of any research project were ever discovered, nor were there any signs of other participants. And, of course, there was no sign of Mercer. My doctor told me that my body was under extreme stress from prolonged sleep deprivation and that I'd likely experienced vivid hallucinations. But sometimes at night, when the lights are low, I swear I hear footsteps in the corridor or faint whispers drifting through the ventilation. I force my eyes shut, telling myself it's just remnant trauma. It never helps. 3 weeks later, they discharged me and my parents took me home. Since then, I've tried to settle back into a normal routine, but something is missing. Every time I try to sleep, I linger in a half-awake state, listening for any sound. Sleep never truly comes. One morning, I worked up the courage to look in the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, and for a few seconds, everything seemed fine. Then, my reflection blinked too late. And now I wonder, did I ever really wake up at all?
And that was The Blackout Experiment by Craig Groshek, performed by Malcolm Blackwood. You know, Malcolm, after hearing that, I'm starting to think that our minds may not be as stable as we think.
I'd say so. Take away the basics, like sleep. like control, and you get more than just people losing their way. You get a new kind of nightmare.
Yes, and sometimes it's what we forget, or what is taken from us, that leaves the deepest scar. Our next story takes us to a place where tradition isn't just a part of life, it's the very thing that keeps you alive. But at what cost? Our third tale tonight is a chilling reminder that every community has its secrets, and some traditions may come with a price far darker than you could ever imagine. Performed by yours truly, this is The Sacrifice by Mark Lynch. The town I grew up in was an unusual place. It's only when looking back years later that I fully appreciate the bizarre practices and brutal nature of our small mountain community. A therapist or a social worker would probably tell me I was raised in a cult, conditioned from childhood to believe in a shared delusion promoted by our town's elders, a corrupt elite committed to controlling the population through fear and lies. Things weren't that simple, however. It seems crazy to say so, but my hometown really was an idyllic place to grow up. Our community was isolated and far from the hustle and bustle of big city life, but this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Our little slice of heaven had it all. Beautiful pine forests, majestic snow-capped mountains, crystal clear streams, and clean, fresh air. Our community was tight-knit, peaceful, prosperous, and crime-free. This sounds like a cliché, but ours was a town where everyone watched out for one another, and you could leave your doors unlocked at night. Sounds perfect, right? But of course, there was a catch. A damn big one as it goes. The summer solstice was the most important date in our town's calendar because it was the night of the sacrifice. One night of bloodshed. That's what it took to protect our little town, to keep us safe, healthy, and prosperous. And all we had to do was offer up one victim for the beast to devour. It's strange to grow up with this dark secret hanging over the town, one that no one wanted to discuss or even acknowledge. I was an only child, but the kids in our community felt like my brothers and sisters, and we all grew up together. For us kids, summer was always the best time of year. Winter's cold winds and heavy snows were replaced by hot, sunny days, and we could play down by the creek and into the woods. At the time, I didn't understand why my parents and other adults became so uneasy during the summer months, why they insisted that we didn't venture into the forest after dark, or why all the townfolk were banned from entering the forbidden zone under any circumstances, except, of course, on the night of the annual ritual. I was 15 before I learned a terrible truth. My parents let me enjoy my birthday with my friends before my father sat me down and told me about our town's sordid history. I guess that was the day my childhood ended. Gone were the teenage hijinks, the immature tantrums, and the fleeting romances I had once enjoyed. From that day forth, the blinkers were off, and I was forced to confront the harsh reality of our situation. It seems ridiculous when I recount my father's words, but I saw the seriousness in his eyes as he spoke and realized this was no joke. From the time of our town's foundation, we'd been under the dominion of the beast, the monster that lurks deep below the ground, emerging from its cave just once a year to feed. No one's entirely sure what the beast is, perhaps a demon or an ancient one from the world that came before ours. Maybe there are others like it scattered across the globe. Perhaps there are other communities like the one I grew up in, small settlements tied to feeding these unexplainable entities, serving up blood sacrifices in their own secret Faustian bargains. I can't say for sure whether our experience is unique, but my town made a deal with the devil in return for our survival, and I was part of it. You see, the revelation on my 15th birthday was just the beginning of my induction into this life of terror. 15 is when they tell you the truth. 16 is when the boys participate in the ritual for the first time. That was the summer when I got blood on my hands. I'll never forget the day of the hunt. In many ways, the horrors that came after were far worse, burning a black mark in my memory which I'll never be able to erase. But it's the hunt that haunts me the most, as I can never forgive myself for the part I played in the murder of an innocent man. It was a pleasant July morning when our party assembled in the old hunting lodge on the western side of town, on the edge of the forest. The sun shone down upon us as we sat out in the open for our final briefing. There were a dozen men and boys in total, ranging in age from grandfathers to teenage first-timers like me. All were clad in hunting gear and hiking boots. We were armed, but only with non-lethal weapons: tranquilizer rifles, cattle prods, and nets. We needed to take our target alive, after all. The mood that morning was somber. I remember a few of the younger guys trying to crack jokes, but they were soon put into their place. The huntmaster was our town's sheriff, a grizzled 30-year veteran named Troy. I think we were all a bit scared of him, my father included. Honestly, I remember very little about Sheriff Troy's stern briefing on the morning of our expedition. Truth be told, he wasn't much of an orator. His speeches were dry, methodical, and to the point. But the hunts were run with military precision. Our target that summer day was a homeless drifter who had wandered into our locality and was apparently living rough in an old abandoned cabin deep in the forest. I felt very uneasy about the whole enterprise, even as we trekked into the woods in pursuit of our prey. I stuck close to my dad during our long hike, the sweat dripping off my brow as I whispered in his ear. "I don't understand, Dad. Why does this have to be this guy?" I asked. "He's just some homeless out-of-towner. What did he ever do to us?" My father shot me a stern look before uttering his reply. "Keep your voice down, Junior." He nodded to the path before us, where Sheriff Troy led the line of hunters under the tall trees. We deliberately lagged behind the rest so my father could speak to me more freely and out of earshot. "I told you, son, it has to be this way. It's not personal. The target hasn't done us any harm, that's true. Sacrificing this man is not something we should treat lightly. It's a terrible thing indeed, but it's better than the alternative." "You sure about that?" I shot back defiantly. "I am," my father answered firmly while staring me down. "Have you forgotten our history? Remember what I taught you, son?" I paused for a moment, thinking as we continued our walk. "The summer of '68, I said thoughtfully. "Sure," my father answered solemnly. "Before my time, but your grandfather suffered through it. That was the year they elected a new council who pledged to stop the ritual. No sacrifice was made that year. And what happened? The church hall burnt to the ground, taking the lives of 20 innocent souls. The worst disaster in our town's history, all because we didn't follow the rules. Well, let me tell you, son, we started up that ritual again the next summer and haven't missed a year since. But there's a correct way of doing things, and the beast doesn't take kindly to deviations." "The summer of '97, I muttered, remembering my history lessons all too well. "Correct," my dad confirmed with a nod. "That was the year we failed to find a suitable sacrifice in time, although not for a lack of trying. Well, the entire town was on the verge of panic. Nobody knew what to do, but then we got a volunteer. Old man Lars, 88 years of age, widowed, and diagnosed with terminal bowel cancer. The old-timer knew he was on his way out and agreed to sacrifice himself for the good of the community. He showed a lot of bravery and got us out of a tough jam, but no one was happy about sacrificing one of our own. We asked the doctor to sedate Larson before the ritual. Didn't want him to suffer, you see. Well, the beast could tell the difference. They say he likes his prey to be healthy and conscious, with some fight left in them. Anyway, our town suffered in the months that followed. There wasn't a major disaster like in '68, but we were punished in other ways. The most brutal winter in decades, a poor harvest for our farmers, and a string of miscarriages in the community. There's always a cost, son, you understand? We don't have a choice. I nodded my head, but kept my mouth shut as we continued our solemn trek through the woods, picking up the pace as we caught up with our companions. I'd heard these arguments before and had no honest answer to them, but still, the whole idea of a human sacrifice made me feel sick to my stomach. I don't know how I'd act when it came to the grisly deed, but I didn't want to let my father and the others down, so I kept my mouth shut and walked on. We didn't find the drifter in the old cabin. There were signs he'd been there, staying recently, but no trace of the man himself. We spent the rest of the day searching for him in the vicinity, hours of trekking through the dense woods to no avail. We brought in hunting dogs that afternoon to assist in the search, but Sheriff Troy and his men were becoming increasingly desperate. No one could understand how the drifter was evading us for so long. My father reckoned he must have had military training, which was later confirmed, but our target could only get so far on foot, and he couldn't hide forever. It was nearly dusk by the time my father and I stumbled upon the poor unfortunate. I remember being hungry, exhausted, thoroughly pissed off by this point, having spent an entire day on what seemed like a futile enterprise. A part of me hoped that the drifter would escape our net and the sacrifice would be canceled, but I didn't dare voice this hope to my father. I did, of course, fear what would happen to our town if we failed to deliver. The two of us were marching along the creek bank in the fading light when we heard the dogs' frantic barking as Sheriff Troy's group closed in on the target. We saw the figure darting between the trees about 100 yards ahead of us, my father pointing and shouting excitedly as he loaded his rifle and took up the chase. I followed in his footsteps, darting past the tall trees as we quickly closed the gap. The drifter was caught out in the open, frantic, exhausted, and disheveled, but seemingly still filled with defiance. I saw his ripped and soiled clothes, his unkempt beard, and wild eyes, now focused upon my father. My dad hesitated momentarily before lifting his rifle to his shoulder and squeezing the trigger. The tranquilizer dart tore through the air, but my father's aim was off and he missed the target by inches. Dad was panicking now, struggling to load a fresh dart into the gun and swearing while his hands shook. I expected the drifter to flee, but I guess he had his fill of running. Instead, something lit up in his dark eyes. A fiery rage born out of prolonged mistreatment and being hunted down like a dog. "You lousy son of a bitch," the drifter swore, directing his anger toward my struggling father. "I'll kill you." With that, the desperate drifter charged across the forest floor, screaming bloody murder as he set upon my father. Dad didn't have time to reload before his attacker was upon him, knocking him to the ground. I watched in horror as the attacker pinned my father down with surprising strength and wrapped his enormous hands around his throat, slowly throttling him with murderous intent. I was terrified but knew I couldn't simply stand back and watch my father being murdered, and so I rushed forward, striking the drifter with my cattle prod and unleashing a surge of electricity into his vulnerable body. The drifter released his grip on my father's throat, his body convulsing as he collapsed in a heap on the forest floor. I heard the dogs barking and men shouting, so I reckoned the sheriff's party was close. But my priority was my father, as I ran to his side and helped him up to his feet. Dad coughed and spluttered, but was able to talk hoarsely through his damaged throat. He looked me in the eye as he did so, tears forming as he became emotional. "Well done, my boy. You did me proud," he spluttered. I didn't have time to process his words before the cavalry arrived, the hounds barking maniacally as the sheriff and his men charged in to secure their target. The drifter had been captured, and now the sacrifice could begin. Our victim fought struggled, and swore all the way to the caves, making so much trouble that we had to securely bind and gag him before dragging his prone body up to the mountainside. All the preparations for the ritual had been made, with almost the entire adult population of town being in attendance. Hundreds of our friends and neighbors standing out in the open on that warm summer's night, with the clearing at the base of the mountain lit up by burning torches. The mood was somber, but there was also a strange energy in the crowd, something akin to excitement or a twisted bloodlust. I didn't like the atmosphere that night and didn't feel like I knew these people anymore. I knew this wasn't right, but did nothing to stop the ritual, as I lacked the courage to do so. The womenfolk were present too. Although they didn't traditionally take part in the hunt, they always attended the ceremony. That was a shared responsibility. My mother came to our side, her pale face filled with worry and concern. She was horrified upon hearing how close her husband had come to death, but Mom proclaimed how proud she was of me for saving the day. I remember how she hugged me tightly under the stars and the moon, but her embrace felt cold to me. The ritual commenced shortly before midnight, as a hushed shudder came over the crowd. In the minutes that followed, the only sound was the muffled whimpering of our victim, who lay hogtied on the grass, still struggling with all his strength against the tight ropes. But other than the desperate grunts of the bound and gagged captive, there was not a sound to be heard. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. I guess they knew what was coming better than I did. And then the chanting began. Hundreds of townfolk speaking in unison, little more than a whisper at first, but soon rising to a crescendo. I was nearly deafened by their repeated words, wanting more than anything to flee from the scene, but there was nowhere to run. It was as if my family, friends, and neighbors were all under a trance controlled by an unseen presence and transformed into something monstrous. I'll never forget the chilling words of their wicked chant. We speak to the god in the mountain, the beast which dwells beneath our feet. We offer this sacrifice in fear and humility to ensure your continued slumber and our town's good fortune. Take this gift, our unholy one. Devour his flesh and leave us in peace. I felt my body shaking as I watched the horrific scene unfold before me. The bound drifter was around 50 yards from the entrance to the dark cave that cut into the mountain's base. I didn't know what exactly dwelt within that dark crevice, but I sensed it was evil. As for the victim, he somehow managed to loosen his gag, calling out in frantic panic as he faced the coming nightmare. "Let me go, you damn freaks!" he screamed. "You people are all nuts!" Nobody responded to his cries or made any effort to assist him, and in the moments that followed, several things happened at once. Firstly, a sudden burst of hot air emanated from inside the cave, bringing with it a foul stench like rotting flesh. The warm wind blew out all of our torches, and even our electric devices failed as the entire site was plunged into darkness, with the only dim light coming from the stars and crescent moon above. And then came the roar, a guttural, predatory growl which chilled my bones. The terrified victim finally managed to undo his binds, screaming as he struggled to escape. But the beast had already had the ascent, and it was fast. The colossal creature thundered up the tunnel and soon reached the cave's entrance. I couldn't see the monster clearly in the darkness, and perhaps that was the point. But what I could see was terrifying. A large animal that ran on all fours, with huge glowing red eyes and a long snout filled with rows of shark-like teeth. I can't say precisely how big the monster was, but I'd guess it was at least as large as a rhinoceros. And it was fast. The drifter screamed again, louder this time. He desperately attempted to remove the remaining ropes and flee from the coming attack, but the monster had him in its sights. Instinctively, I wanted to run to the old man's aid. I knew this wasn't right, and I couldn't stand by and let it happen, but as I tried to move forward, I felt a firm hand on my shoulder stopping me. Turning in anger, I saw my father was the one holding me back, shaking his head in the negative. I might have fought him, but it was already too late. The beast unleashed another blood-curdling roar and then charged, the ground shaking under its heavy hooves as it descended upon its prey. The drifter ran but didn't get far, and the beast knocked him down and dug its sharp claws into his back. The victim cried out in agony as his blood spilled onto the grass. Even then, he didn't give up, attempting to crawl away from the salivating predator. But the beast showed no mercy, opening its huge maw and biting deep into his torso. Oh, the poor bastard was nearly bitten in two, and yet somehow he still clung to life, whimpering and pleading weakly as the monster carried his limp body in its jaws. "Please, please, God, someone help me." But no one did. Not a single soul lifted a finger or even uttered a word. Hundreds of townsfolk just stood there in the clearing, watching as the monster dragged its still-living prey back into the cave. Before long, both had disappeared into the darkness, but we could still hear the awful sounds of the doomed man's dying cries, closely followed by the sickening noise of teeth biting into flesh and bones snapping under the beast's powerful jaws. This horror continued for a few more moments before the beast dragged its prey deeper into the cave, where it could devour him at its leisure. Shockingly, the crowd seemed unaffected by the atrocity and just witnessed. A few soft murmurs were audible before Sheriff Troy took charge and shouted out to address the crowd. "All right, people, that's done for another year. Y'all need to go home now. Go home and have a peaceful night." And that was it. All the townsfolk quickly dispersed, calmly walking away from the murder scene without a second thought, acting like they were simply leaving a concert or football game. It was only then that the sheer horror of the situation hit home, and I felt acidic bile rising in my throat. I bent over, vomiting on the grass. I sensed my parents' presence by my side. My mother rubbed me gently on my back as my father whispered comforting words into my ear. "It's okay, son. First time's always the worst, but it gets easier, really, it does." But I didn't want it to get easier. I never wanted to participate in that hellish ritual again. 1 week after the sacrifice, I ran away from home, taking a bus to the other side of the country and never coming back. I know I hurt my parents by leaving. Despite their faults, I'm sure they loved me. But I couldn't be part of that. Not again. I write to my parents once a year on my birthday just to let them know I'm still alive. It's been a decade since I fled my hometown, and this is the first time I've ever spoken about what happened. My community is still very much in existence. I haven't returned and never will, but I keep tabs on them and follow the local news. There have been no major disasters or losses of life in the past 10 years, and this can only mean one thing: that the annual ritual is still occurring and fresh sacrifices are being offered up to the beast every summer. I know what they're doing back home is very wrong, evil even. But I've never gone to the authorities with what I know, and I'll never name my hometown or reveal its exact location. Despite everything, I still care about the people there and love my parents. And so, for better or for worse, I'll take this secret to my grave. And that was The Sacrifice by Mark Lynch, as performed by yours truly. A little reminder, perhaps, that traditions are often built on darker foundations than we'd care to admit.
More like built on bones, Otis. A town willing to do anything to stay prosperous? Well, that always comes back to bite you.
Indeed. And the price of safety can often be more than we're willing to pay.
Thank you, my friends, for joining us tonight. And if you enjoyed tonight's tales, we've got plenty more where those came from. For just $7.99 a month, you can join our patrons area and unlock the full extended episode ad-free with exclusive content you won't find anywhere else.
Head over to simplyscarypodcast.com, click Patrons, and you'll be directed to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where a whole world of horror awaits.
Support indie creators, enjoy a world of horror, and keep the darkness close at hand. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to our parent channel, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube, and tap that bell icon so you never miss an episode. Once you're there, you'll have a veritable smorgasbord of audio horror fiction, including several more scintillating programs on our network.
And while you're at it, check out my other podcast, the recently redubbed Otis Jiry's Tales from Duskwood, where I bring you even more chilling tales to keep you awake each and every Wednesday night. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Also, don't forget to follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
And if you want to chat with me directly, go ahead and look me up too. I always love hearing from you, my friends. I'm on most of the popular media sites, so pick your poison and let me know what you thought of tonight's episode.
And last but not least, don't forget the amazing authors behind tonight's stories. Check out their other work, visit their websites, buy their books as available, and help keep the terror alive for generations to come. They and we appreciate your support.
Well, my friends, that's it for tonight's episode. From mysterious disappearances to dark traditions, we've seen how shadows can become more than just fleeting thoughts. They can become part of our very souls. But remember, sometimes the only way to escape them is to face them head on. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and most importantly, stay scared.
Sweet dreams, listeners. Sweet dreams.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's OTIS@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.